The Sign of the Chrysanthemum by Catherine Patterson. Chapter 4. At the Red Dog. While he waited for the snoring Ronan to rouse himself, Muna stared in amazement at the scene, which, as the morning grew older, came to life before the steps of Rashomon Gate. Fanning out on either side were rows upon rows of tiny stalls, where, if one had a little money, one could buy fish, cheap cloth, sandals, even amusement, for there were itinerant musicians to be seen, and under a tree 3 girls were dancing to the delight of a small crowd. Peddlers passed by, bent under loaded frames, hawking clogs and good luck charms, crickets in tiny bamboo cages, a noodle vendor, his brazier on one end of a bamboo pole, and bowls of foodstuffs on the other, called out to the crowd. The smell of noodles bubbling in a meat broth assailed Muna's nose. Had he not eaten with the sandal maker and his daughter, he would have perished. Even so, he found that he was hungry again. The merchants were poorly clad, and their merchandise, for the most part, was inferior. But to Muna, who had known only the destitute life of a serf, they seemed quite grand. It was the others, the strange little creatures who seemed to live on the portico of the gate, who horrified the boy. They all looked alike, sharp little bird-like faces, dull eyes peering out from under filthy, matted hair. Rags, instead of clothes, hung from their bent frames. One such creature was watching a woman roasting meat on spits over a charcoal brazier. The woman turned to speak to a customer who seemed to be complaining about the spit of meat he had just bought. The man smelled the meat elaborately and then stuck it under the woman's nose. Both of them gestured angrily. At last, the man hurled the spit away. The elderly little creature who had been watching swooped down upon it and snatched it up almost before it touched the ground. He darted toward the portico, but 2 younger beggars blocked his way. There was a scuffle in which the 2 others soon prevailed, snatching away the older man's prize. He screamed a curse on them and then suddenly, aged again, hobbled up the steps past Muna to a dark corner of the portico where he could nurse his disappointment. The boy turned his face away. He was sickened by the whole scene, and he despised the creature whose wretchedness caused this discomfort. With relief, he saw that Takanobu was waking up. Now they would soon be off to see the grand sights of the capital of which he had often dreamed. "I don't suppose you have a copper on you?" Takanobu asked as he washed his face at the public well located near the gate. Muna, squatting beside him, shook his head. "My usual luck," the Ronin shrugged. He stood up, wiping his face with the tail of his tunic. "So I borrowed a bit of luck from our friend the captain." He drew something from the fold of his garment which flashed in the sunlight. "First, I must find old Plumface." For a moment, the boy failed to understand fully. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The feeling buzzed about in his head like a huge wasp. Then it lit. Takanobu has stolen something from the ship. The samurai was a thief. In Awa, Muna had seen a thief once, a serf who had stolen a chicken from the daimyo's flock. The man's hands had been cut off and his hut burned to the ground. The other serfs had thrown rocks as the thief ran, wounded and howling, into the hills. Stunned with horror now, Muna followed this happy, joking thief through the marketplace. Plumface proved to be a peddler. He got his name, no doubt, from the large purple birthmark that marred the left half of his face. Muna found it hard to look into the man's eyes. "Come now, Plumface," Takanobu was arguing. "You know it's worth more than that. It's solid silver. Feel it." "Who'd you steal it from?" The peddler's voice was harsh, but he took the object. "Steal?" Takanobu asked ingenuously. "A family heirloom, by my honor." The peddler spat from the side of his crooked mouth. Then he turned to the small silver Buddha over in his hands. Muna stared at his feet as Takanobu shifted about impatiently. Finally, Plumface drew a few silver coins from a purse at his belt. Takanobu stuck out his big hand and quickly closed his fingers over the money. "Until next time, Ronin," replied the humorless voice. Takanobu started down Suzaku Oji, the broad, willow-lined avenue that led from Rashomon Gate to the Imperial Palace, with Muna at his heels, skipping to keep up with his companion's long strides. As he walked, Takanobu tied the peddler's coins in a kerchief and shoved them into his tunic. So there was to be no punishment for the Ronin's crime. The city was a strange place indeed. At Rokujo Avenue, they turned west. Muna recognized it, his heart thumping, as the boisterous street where he had made a fool of himself the night before. He prayed no one would recognize him. At noon, the street was a pleasant, bustling place, but the houses with the many latticed windows seemed to sneer down at him as he passed. Takanobu turned abruptly into a doorway. "Welcome to the Red Dog," he said over his shoulder as he pushed his way past the curtain which hung over the entrance. The tiny room was nearly filled with men, eating and drinking noisily. Most of them were as ragged as the Ronin and Muna himself. A few looked up to smile and nod. "Ah, welcome home, Takanobu. It has been a long time," a young waitress called out. "Ya, it's good to be home, Raiko." Takanobu patted the girl's cheek. "How's your beautiful mistress?" A fat woman stuck her face through the doorway at the back. "No credit." Takanobu threw both hands into the air. "You never trust me, Auntie." He motioned to Muna to sit down and ordered noodles for them both and rice wine for himself. The fat woman stood over them, glowering. With elaborate gestures, Takanobu withdrew the kerchief from his tunic, untied the corner, and pressed one of the silver coins into the woman's hand. She looked at the coin as though she doubted its validity. Then, with a shrug and a snort, she produced the change in copper coins from the purse at her waist and retired once more to the kitchen. Two men wearing swords joined Takanobu and Muna at their low table. "Koishi? Ogasa? My friend Muna. Little no-name." Muna bowed and tried to hide his blush. The men nodded toward him without interest. "Now, tell me, Koishi," said Takanobu, "from which direction is the wind strongest these days?" "From the west," replied the shorter of the two men. "So?" Takanobu's eyebrow went up. "Without doubt," Ogasa said, "but winds have been known to change, eh?" Takanobu smiled. Muna was afraid to break into this peculiar conversation, but he could make nothing of what the men were saying. He was all the more confused then when Takanobu said, "I thought the boy might get a job in the stables. A good place to sniff the wind. Don't you agree?" The men laughed and began to settle Muna's future among themselves without consulting him. It was decided that Ogassa should take Muna to the imperial stables as soon as they finished eating, for the sooner he was at work, the better. And besides, said Takanobu, I have these coins to get rid of along Rokujo Avenue tonight. No place for a beardless boy, now is it? The others slapped their knees and laughingly agreed. It seemed strange, even to a country boy like Muna, that these ragged ronin should have influence in the imperial stables. As it turned out, Ogassa knew a bean cake vendor, who knew a tavern maid, who knew one of the grooms at the stables. The groom agreed to take the boy on in repayment for a modest bribe. Thus, by afternoon, Muna had become one of the boys who worked and lived in the stables of the Imperial Guards. The stable boys were not trusted to groom the valuable war horses of the guardsmen. They cleaned the stalls and carried feed for the animals and served the grooms and soldiers assigned to the stables. The hours were long and the work hard. But at the beginning, Muna did not complain, for he was warmer and better fed than he had ever been in Awa. In addition, there was the glamour of the scene to feed upon, the beautiful horses and magnificent samurai, both Genji and Heiki, who rode them. Why, one of them might be his own father. But the glamour dimmed as Muna realized that the stable captain never allowed the boys to speak to the guardsmen. It's as though we were outcasts, Muna grumbled to himself. The incident between Takanobu and Plumface had stuck in the boy's throat like a bone. But now, as he compared the Ronin to the unapproachable Imperial Guardsmen, it was a kind of comfort that the Ronin, at least, did not despise him. In fact, had saved his hide from the ship captain. And somehow, morality in the capital seemed written in a language the boy did not yet understand. In Awa, the poor lived forever under the heel of the daimyo, nor did it ever occur to them that they might do otherwise. But here was Takanobu, one of the luckless of the world, by his own admission, who felt no obligation to live out his life under anyone's foot. If one is luckless, the Ronin seemed to reason, he should make his own luck, or borrow it, or steal it. Takanobu did the last with such a flourish that even his victims could not wholly despise him. And Muna, whom he had befriended, fell more and more under the Ronin's roguish charm. He began to tie his hair up on his head in the untidy version of a samurai topknot that Takanobu affected. Muna's voice was changing pitch, so there was little to be done with it. But he did practice in private Takanobu's merry obscenities and irreverent manner of address. Indeed, as his preoccupation with the Ronin grew, the vision of his father dimmed. In his mind, he justified the fact that he was not searching for his father by telling himself that he had to learn more about the capital, make friends with influential persons, before he could pursue his search. Besides, didn't he owe something to the man who had saved him from the ship captain's wrath and helped him get work in the city? Though it was never agreed upon in so many words, Muna would take the few coppers he earned each week and give them to Takanobu, who had not yet managed to find himself a job. They always met in the Red Dog. Usually either Koishi or Ogassa would join them. Invariably, the men would press Muna for gossip he had picked up from the soldiers. He began to enjoy filling their hungry ears with the tales he heard and would make a special effort to hang about the soldiers to learn extra tidbits for his weekly audience. This week the Genji warriors are angrier than ever, he reported one night late in November. So, said Takanobu, and all three men leaned closer to Muna. Of course, the boy did not know what the Genji members of the Imperial Guards were thinking. He got no closer to these exalted figures than their horses' feed troughs. But he knew what the stable soldiers and the grooms were saying. This he reported with the air of one who had eavesdropped upon state secrets. His Majesty has given Lord Kiyomori another large castle. He heaps more and more honors now on the Heike. He paused, concentrating on his teacup. I fear the Genji are very jealous for their clan. The men smiled at each other. As well they might be, continued Muna. Lord Kiyomori of the Heike is the greatest samurai in Japan. There was a silence. Ogasa cleared his throat noisily. I didn't know you were such a great admirer of the Heike, puppy. Takanobu slouched on an elbow and stretched his long legs out on the mat floor. Yes, Muna's eyes were shining. I saw him once at the stables. He's not very tall, you know, but very powerful. He looked toward me, and I began to shake all over. The men laughed. I guess I never told you. Muna's voice was as casual as he could make it. My father is a Heike warrior. Oh? Takanobu poured himself more wine. How do you know? Why, my mother told me. All three men were looking at him, but he could not read what their expressions meant. He wished at once that he had not told them. They would think him a silly braggart. As the weeks went by, it became apparent to Muna that the three men had cooled toward him. Each week he stored up more to tell them, but they seemed less interested than before. Twice when he went to the Red Dog, none of them appeared, and he had to leave his money with the girl Raiko and trust her to get it to Takanobu. He repented often that he had spoken of his father. He felt sure that he had offended the ragged Ronin who had been such a friend to him. It was a cold winter. The rivalry between the warriors of the Genji and the Heike clans increased. For as the soldiers spent the long winter evenings huddled around their tiny charcoal burners, they talked. And in their idle talk, they stumbled upon grievances they had not realized themselves. The stable boys were disgruntled too, for the captain had ordered a thorough scrub down of the stables in preparation for the new year according to the Chinese calendar. The day before New Year's Eve was Muna's 14th birthday, but he hardly remembered it. His hands were raw and cracked from the icy scrub water, and he was exhausted from the extra work. He wanted nothing more than a long sleep under his quilt in the corner of the stable. But he knew Takanobu might be waiting, and he did not want to disappoint him. Welcome home, Muna, Takanobu waved to Muna as he entered the Red Dog. All three men were there, and they greeted him warmly. Raiko, some warm wine for the boy. See how cold he is, Takanobu called out. So, they had forgiven him his stupid bragging, or perhaps he'd only imagined their coldness. Muna smiled gratefully as Takanobu poured the steaming wine into his cup. Always before, they had ordered tea for him. He sipped the white liquid and let it warm him. He was so cold and tired. Hey, don't go to sleep. We need you, puppy. Muna straightened and forced open his eyes. To the Rashomon Gate, Takanobu was saying. I go by myself, but the foolish Plumface is angry and might refuse to speak to me at all. Terrible man when he's angry. Koishi twisted one side of his mouth in a clumsy imitation of Plumface's leer. Wicked fellow, agreed Ogasa, elaborately blowing his nose. Muna was still drowsy when he stumbled out of the Red Dog, clutching the folded note that Takanobu had given him to take to Plumface. But the freezing drizzle soon pierced his thin tunic and made him uncomfortably alert. Despite the weather and the hour, the streets were crowded. Everyone was busy preparing for the new year. The creatures who lived in the shadow of Rashomon Gate were also bustling about. Some were washing their wretched garments in the icy water from the public well, ludicrous figures clad only in loincloths and goosebumps. The stalls of Thieves' Market were being scrubbed down just as the imperial stables had been earlier in the day. Even to these, the scum of the capital, the new year held out a magical hope for something better than they had ever known. Muna moved through the throng looking for Plumface. He had never gotten over his shyness with city people, especially these. Their poverty was not strange to him, but everything else about them was. He hesitated to speak, for he hated to be laughed at by such as these. But when he was sure that Plumface was not in sight, he approached one of the communal bonfires. For a few moments he squatted quietly, warming his hands. Out of the corner of his eye, he studied the man beside him. The face was old and pitted with smallpox scars. Others in the circle were shouting and laughing across the fire, but the old one was staring quietly into the flames. Muna leaned closer and said into the old man's ear, "Excuse me, grandfather, but have you seen Plumface the peddler tonight?" The old man turned slowly and looked into Muna's face. His dull eyes were red-rimmed from the smoke. "He is dead, boy, nearly 2 months now. But if you have something you must sell, old Nishiwa in the Thieves' Market." "Dead? Plumface dead? And for 2 months? Why hadn't Takanobu heard by now?" He murmured an apology to the old beggar and started back toward the Red Dog. In his mind, he went over the conversation he had had earlier with the 3 Ronin. There had been something peculiar, something he could not quite understand about their behavior. Perhaps it was one of Takanobu's jokes. That was it. He could see the men now, back in the Red Dog, warm from their wine, laughing at him for going out into the freezing night like a stupid, trusting old dog. Muna unfolded the note. It was too dark to see the writing, which he could not have read even if he could have seen it. He crumpled the paper and let it fall to the street. The more he thought of the Ronin and his friends, warm and merry from their wine, their raucous voices calling out his name in derision, the more irritated he became. He had nearly decided to return directly to the stables and leave them to their laughter, when something in the air caught his attention. Above the rooftops, there was a light. He began to run toward it. Now he could smell smoke and hear the sounds that came from the direction of the west and Rokujo Avenue, like pigs at the slaughtering. The gods have mercy! Takanobu and the others would be dead drunk by now. All his irritation vanished as he ran. Takanobu was his friend. He pushed through the crowd that clogged the entrance to the avenue. In the confusion of soldiers trying to put out the fire, and the painted ladies and their customers who were seeking to escape, no one tried to stop a skinny boy dodging through the confusion straight into the heart of the blackest smoke. He could hardly breathe. But he forced his body through the searing heat until he came to where the red dog had stood. "Takanobu! Takanobu!" the boy cried out, choked by the smoke and the sight before him. For the insatiable dragon had already engorged the flimsy wooden structure and had gone on, belching flames, to satisfy its appetite elsewhere. "If only I hadn't left him," the boy cried, cursing himself as he stumbled toward the river at the end of the avenue. "I should have known he was drunk. I should have known he was teasing again." And then Muna collapsed.